BBC News with Sue Montgomery. A court in Washington has convicted 4 members of a far-right militia group of seditious conspiracy for their part in the Capitol riots in 2021. The 4 men, all belonging to the Oath Keepers group, were also found guilty of other felony and obstruction charges. Gary O'Donoghue reports from Washington.
This is the second trial involving key members of the Oath Keepers and their part in the Capitol riots on January the 6th, 2 years ago. Last year, its founder, Stewart Rhodes, and another co-defendant were also found guilty of the same sedition charge, which requires the prosecution to show that the defendants planned to use violence to further their political plot. All 6 will be sentenced in the coming months and could face decades behind bars. Another 5 defendants from the Proud Boys far-right group are also standing trial in the same court building in Washington. They are also charged with seditious conspiracy.
A former minister in Mexico's government has gone on trial in the United States, accused of accepting huge bribes from a drug cartel. Prosecutors told the court that Genaro Garcia Luna engaged in the very trafficking he was in charge of stopping. He has pleaded not guilty. Gustavo Moar, who was General Secretary of Mexico's main intelligence agency under the same presidency of Felipe Calderón, said the charges were unexpected.
Calderón trusted him a lot and gave him a lot of power and a lot of authority that made Garcia Luna really the most influential officer fighting drug cartels in Mexico during the Calderón administration. I was surprised, and many of us are surprised, what happened when he was arrested in the United States.
A former top FBI official charged with violating American sanctions on Russia has pleaded not guilty in a federal court. Charles McGonigal is accused of receiving secret payments from the oligarch Oleg Deripaska, an ally of President Putin, who last year was himself charged with violating US sanctions. Israel and the US have launched their biggest ever joint military exercise. It comes at a time of high tensions between Washington and Tehran. Mike Thompson reports.
There's been nothing before on this scale between these two nations. The military drills in Israel, some involving live firing exercises, will involve more than 140 aircraft, a dozen ships and nearly 6,500 US personnel. They'll be watched closely by Iran at a time of growing friction with Washington and the West, following criticism of Tehran's brutal suppression of anti-government protests and the stalled nuclear talks. Though the US insists the drills are not orientated around any particular adversary.
World News from the BBC. Venezuela's Vice President Delcy Rodriguez has said that inflation reached 234% last year, one of the highest rates in the world. But the government says it's made progress thanks to fiscal discipline and has managed to reduce inflation from its peak in 2021, when it reached almost 700%. 16 members of Brazil's Yanomami indigenous tribe have been airlifted from their lands in the Amazon rainforest to be treated for severe malnutrition after the government declared a medical emergency. The Interior Minister accused the previous government of abandoning the indigenous community and promised an investigation. Some 20,000 illegal miners are estimated to operate inside the Yanomami Reserve in the northern state of Roraima, polluting the rivers with mercury, which is used to mine gold. NATO and European Union analysts have warned that Moscow is gaining ground in the information war over the conflict in Ukraine. From Helsinki, Frank Gardner.
From a quiet backstreet office in Helsinki, analysts have been closely monitoring opinions in NATO countries on the war in Ukraine. Russian disinformation about who is to blame for the war is having a noticeable effect. 19% of Germans polled said they viewed Russia's invasion as a justified response to provocation by NATO. In both Slovakia and Hungary, more than a quarter of those polled believed the Kremlin's narrative that Russia's invasion was necessary to disarm and denazify Ukraine. In both Greece and Italy, many respondents said they held Ukraine, the EU or the US responsible for the war.
Portugal has announced that all debt repayments it receives from its former colony of Cape Verde will be fully reinvested into the tiny African country to drive its transition to a more sustainable future. The archipelago owes Portugal more than $650 million. BBC News.